Snoqualmie and Suquamish, who have been and continue to be the stewards of this land throughout the generations. Let's also acknowledge that the Duwamish people are still fighting for federal recognition as a tribe. Please join me in taking a moment of silent acknowledgement and gratitude to the land that we're on today and the past and present Native Indigenous people that steward this land. While I'm doing that, I'm also going to drop in the chat opportunity to pay rent to the Duwamish. Let's just take a moment here. All right. See 187 folks here and climbing. So we gathered here today because something significant happened last week. As we all saw, there were some relatively significant errors in judgment that happened by our fundraising colleagues and their organizations. We're not here today to diagnose what happened there. We're here today because ethical dilemmas, ethical issues happen to us every day. It happened to us in all of our organizations across our sector. And what happened last week has in part, chipped away a little bit of the community trust in our field as fundraisers. And I've been in contact with a lot of folks in our community, and people are upset. It's hard to see fundraising show up in that light in the newspaper. That's not where we want to be. And it's also, just one example. There are plenty of examples of unethical behavior that I'm sure we've experienced, perhaps been a part of, or heard about in our field. And we wanted to gather today to give us a chance to process, to reflect, but also to think about ethics and think about equity in our fundraising practices and how we as a community can come together and recommit to fundraising in ethical and equitable ways. There's a whole lot of topics and pieces to this conversation, and we're not going to get to, this is going to be the tip of the iceberg today. So as we go, there's going to be some opportunities to drop questions in the chat that we may not get to, and we're going to do our best to record those ideas and suggestions and questions that you all posed today, and we'll provide future spaces for us to gather and grapple with these as a community. To give you a sense of what's going to happen today, I'm going to turn it over in just a minute to our colleague Derek, who is from our global office, AFP global office, to share just a few brief reflections from the kind of national scale around what's happening in our community, and to also talk about the AFP Code of Ethics. And we'll then transition to a panel where we're gathering folks that are bringing different perspectives to this conversation to share and reflect on where we are today. And then we're going to try to prioritize as much time as possible to allow you to get in small groups and talk. I think folks are eager to, clearly by the number of folks on this call, eager to talk and connect. And that's what we hope to spend the majority of the time on today. As we go through this, if anything comes up, technical issues on your side, please feel free to send me a direct message or send our colleague at Advancement Northwest, Brittany London, a direct message in the chat, and we'll be happy to support you. So with that, I will transition to Derek Mulhern, who is the Chief of Staff for our AFP Global Office. Thanks for being with us, Derek.
Thanks, Daniel. You'd think after, 10 months, I could find the mute button a little bit quicker, but I can't. Thanks for having me today. And thanks for taking the lead on this. And first, I'll try to keep this as brief as possible because I think you all want to get engaged in deeper conversation and not just listen to me. But thanks to Daniel, not only for the invite tonight, but more importantly for your leadership on the issue. This is a really painful situation for numerous people and for numerous reasons. Donors getting preference on a life-saving vaccine, both out of line and alongside the inequity in the rollout that's disproportionately affecting Black and Brown communities. So I just really want to take a moment to understand that that pain's real for so many of us, and it really goes against the work that we're doing each and every day in serving our causes and in really working to build stronger trust within our communities for the work that we're doing every day. I had the quick chance to read the article in the Seattle Times earlier this week and saw that Daniel was quoted. And I'm just grateful for leaders who like Daniel, but also like so many others on this call that are just working to push the envelope and stand up as leaders with an expectation of better practices, not just for our communities, but for the work that we're doing as fundraisers. They're both so important. And I just see that as such a meaningful thing. So thank you all for doing that. So really briefly, I just want to talk about ethics and how it's been viewed over the years. As someone who not that long ago was pretty early in my career, ethics was kind of a boring word, and I wouldn't say that it's gotten much more exciting. But we really tend to look at ethics in ways that trap us in a very old style of thinking. I think that that's different for fundraisers. And as I've spoken with many fundraisers, it seems that in many cases, we're really afraid to talk about ethics unless we're really forced to. And today we're forced to. This entire week we've been forced to. But often we can compartmentalize it. And if there's a problem or a controversy, we're quick to really just, take out our code of ethics at AFP. Let's look at the number of code numbers that we have and really just talk about what we do and what we don't do. But if we really wait until the moment to start talking about ethics, we've completely missed the bus. And public perceptions will have already changed because we didn't mention ethics until the damage was already done. And so we have to start talking about ethics earlier. And so I hope we can all walk away from this conversation, regardless of the situation itself, in remembering why ethics and what we do is continually important, regardless of a code that we have that's enforceable or not enforceable. It's just a very important piece of what we do. And it's really one of the key messages that I want you to hear today. AFP Global put out a statement about the issue that was happening specifically in Seattle, but frankly, it's not just happening in Seattle, it's happening throughout the country. And while we do have a code of ethics that's enforceable to each and every individual that's an AFP member, it's a bigger conversation about ethics and how equity is part of that. So it's not just about a code, but about us serving the communities and the causes that we all wake up to advocate for each and every day. So whether those activities are illegal, which in this case, some very well may be, they really transgress the very notion and the spirit of philanthropy, and therefore are clearly unethical and inequitable. For me and for AFP, I really think that AFP should drive equity. And as you as fundraisers, you play such an important role in that. And at times it's a very vulnerable role that you play with your donors. You don't have all of the control, and you don't have all of the control in the seat as the development officer or the fundraiser. Your organizations go deeper than that. So I want to acknowledge that and let you know that AFP is here to support you in those conversations, just like this one, and that we're continuing to look deeper at ourselves as AFP Global to understand how we conduct business in a way that's continually ethical and pushing ethics for the profession to really help drive better equity or stronger equity. So our work as fundraisers, it's really about that trust, and it's a situation like this that allows the communities to lose that trust so quickly. So we must really maintain that trust to really effectively serve the causes that we're working to serve. Excuse me. And ethics isn't just about being a good organization. It's about being an effective organization, one that uses donors' resources effectively and efficiently. And it's about being a principled organization that treats donors with respect, but also understands that those donors do have limitations as well in what their actions are and within our entire organizations. So it's really about having a vision and using the resources to really make that vision a reality. Those are the stories that really encompass ethics, and it's really what it means to be an ethical organization, in my opinion. And those are the stories that we need to keep telling, the things that we continue to do right. Ultimately, AFP Global will continue to stand up for inequities as much as we're able to, and allow that ethics to continue to be a driver of equity for our profession and for our respective organizations. So again, I could talk about ethics for days and bore you, but at the end of the day, I think it's just extremely important that we understand that ethics will always be there, and that a situation like this, as challenging, painful, and as much of a setback as it is, it gives us an opportunity to come together as a community and better understand how we continue to serve our communities in the best way possible. So again, thank you all for being here today. And Daniel, thank you for inviting me. I greatly appreciate it.
Thanks, Derek. Much appreciated. And Derek's going to stick around for a little while if anyone has additional questions. I'm going to pass it on to Peter Drury. Peter's going to moderate our panel. I've known Peter for a long time and looked to him as a mentor. He has been a great voice in recent weeks, and we invited him to support this conversation. Peter's with Wellspring Family Services, and with that, I'll pass it to you, Peter.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, everybody. I'm going to say very little. My job today really is I exist in service of a panel that I'm about to introduce you all to, of three really remarkable people who represent three different aspects of nonprofit leadership and fundraising in our community, who I think are going to really help us cultivate an excellent conversation today. Not a time for me to give a speech, just a time for me to be in unity with all of you at a time of great concern about ethics on the path ahead of us. And I think that one thing that the panelists and I all hold in common is a desire to get this right in the future and for us to hold each other accountable and to create safe spaces for conversations like this one. So I just want to thank AFP Advancement Northwest for calling this conversation together and giving me the privilege of hosting Maya Hemachandra, who for years many of us have admired at Solid Ground and other places before that. She's on the faculty at the University of Washington, both in nonprofit management and in fundraising management. Maya will be one of our panelists. Also, Rehana Lainwala, who is the Director of Marketing and Development at Launch. And she's also super active in community-centered fundraising and that organization and those principles, and we'll bring that perspective here as well. And then Lee Lambert, who brings an executive director's perspective. He's the executive director for City Year, and and knows a lot from that angle as well. When we look at the issue of fundraising and the pressures to engage in behaviors that we know better than to do, and there's a lot of pressures in this profession, as we all know. An executive director has a unique perspective on all that as well, and what they expect from their fundraising staff. So we're hopeful that today that Maya, Rehana, and Lee can help us really focus this conversation, and then again to bring it to the place that Daniel said, which is to allow you all to, in breakout groups and in deeper conversation, to just elevate this dialogue and share your feelings and your perspectives and your sensibilities together. So with that, I would like to start by asking the first question of you, Rehana, and I'm asking you both, kind of in all of your roles, right? Feel free to answer this kind of from whichever perspective you want. But, in a technical sense, inviting major donors to special vaccination clinics might be legal if someone tries to kind of figure out, how to pull strings in the right direction. But for people in nonprofit leadership, for people cultivating philanthropy, and for people who are professional fundraisers, it really generated a great deal of outcry for good reason. Can you give us a sense at a high level of why is prioritizing major donors to receive services like this wrong? What harm does it do in the big picture?
Thank you so much, Peter. There's so much to say about this. I could probably talk for an hour about this, so I will try and keep it reasonably quick. Obviously it's against the AFP Code of Ethics, but taking that aside, I think it's just really morally repugnant to prioritize access to a life-saving vaccine for rich people who can afford to give above a certain amount, especially because we're in the context of a country that already rations access to healthcare. Access to treatment is already limited by what you can afford, and one accident or illness or medical issue could bankrupt you. People literally die in this country because they can't afford treatment. And for a lot of people, if you aren't killed by you're staying in the ICU with a COVID infection, you might be killed by the impact of the huge medical bills that you receive afterwards. And I think what I saw missing in what happened was the focus was on the donors and not on the communities we serve and the well-being of the community we serve. And, I know Overlake put out a statement that said that the people that they were offering the vaccine to wasn't just major donors, it was also patients and volunteers and staff and board members. And people had to prove that they met the criteria for this phase. But there are a lot of people who meet that criteria, and they do not have a pathway to get access to these vaccines. I've got family members and friends and colleagues, and I'm sure all of you on this call today know somebody who really needs it but can't get it. And because they're not rich, they're not major donors, they can't get it. And I think not only do we have that ethical obligation to these communities that we're serving, but I think we also really need to, as fundraisers, look at the obligation we have to repair the harm that has been done to communities who have historically faced oppression. So we know that major donors in this country tend to be largely white. The data shows us that white people in this country have greater household wealth than people of color. And while people of color do give very generously as a percentage of their household income, we know there is a really big racial wealth gap in this country due to structural racism and discrimination, all these practices that prevented asset building and wealth creation. And so you've got a group of people of whom we can presume consists largely of white donors, skipping the line for vaccines during a pandemic that is disproportionately killing Black and Brown communities. People of color are disproportionately represented as essential workers, and women of color, particularly Black and Hispanic or Latino women, are also disproportionately essential workers. So they're putting themselves at risk to earn a paycheck, to keep the lives of those of us who are able to work from home safely going. And then you have rich people jumping the line. And I guarantee that the majority of these major donors either have jobs that allow them to work from home, or they're retired and they're not exposed to any kind of risk in the way that we know our historically underserved communities are. And I haven't even gotten into the issue of disability and the folks who have chronic illnesses or disabilities who are not able to get access. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons why it's really problematic. But I think for me, particularly as a woman of color, looking at these disparities in our community that already exist and the harm that's done when we don't stop to think not just about the nonprofit that we serve, but the broader community.
Thank you, Rehana. I really appreciate your opening up the conversation. So many critical points there. I'm going to turn to Lee Lambert next. Lee, I'm going to ask you to comment on the pressures that cause leaders not necessarily look backwards on the hospitals we're talking about here as much as for this whole group now. What are the pressures that executive directors face, leaders face that get them into these tricky situations? And what do you personally do? Kind of what guidelines or guidance do you have to make ethical decisions?
Yeah, I mean, and I would say the pressure probably extends beyond just the executive director role, but as the leader of a system, that I work in the city year system, and we all work in our different systems. I think about the situation. Did the system work as it has been working, or did it break? And was there a mistake? And likely, this is the difference between this situation and any number of situations at hospitals or other organizations is that this one made it to the Seattle Times, and that there are, and it's because historically how fundraising has been aligned is take care of the donor. That pressure is take care of the donor so you can get the gift. And what we try to do at our organization is really focus on the people we serve and name our values on a regular basis to create a culture that we are focusing on. Are we driving impact towards students or our core or the community? And then going hand in hand with that as a leader, creating an environment in which if we stray away from that, someone on the team can remind us and they feel safe and they will be rewarded for aligning us to our values, not punished for keeping us from going a path. And then, as a leader, what I have to do, the pressure is to, have the courage to not get the gift. Is that there are donors whose needs we're not going to be able to meet when we focus on our community, and we have to be okay that they're not having their gift, and believe that our focus on the community we serve and the people we're prioritizing, which in our case is Black and Brown youth, will attract resources that will meet their needs, not the needs of the donor.
Thank you. Maya, I'm coming to you next, and I'm going to ask you a big one. So this is a really big question for you. And I think about your level as a development leader, most recently at Solid Ground, also in other roles, but to think with us about what is the fundraiser's role in preventing ethical lapses in an organization. I mean, it's a unique leadership role. Can you think about that out loud with us? And what are the options you have at your disposal, or what are the options you wish you had at your disposal as a chief decision maker, as it were?
Yeah, well, and I think I so appreciate what Lee was saying, because oftentimes in our role, we play this interesting dual role as development professionals, where we are there to support the needs of the organization to meet the needs of the community, but we're also a bit of the we hold power, right? We hold the ability to create barriers and boundaries, and we are the power brokers in some ways, where we are the ones who are to have those relationships directly with people with wealth, with systems, with government officials. And so I think that we do have a role in saying what's acceptable or not acceptable, and that if that leadership isn't elsewhere in the organization, I think sometimes we need to step up and take it, because I think there's also, for a lot of the rest of our organizations, that there's this mystique, right? Like in our culture, talking about money is a bit taboo. People, oh, I'll do anything, but don't make me fundraise, don't make me ask for a gift. And so we have this power, but we also have to then the responsibility to help the organization understand why we might say yes or might say no. And one of the things that we did with Solid Ground in December was to create a gift acceptance policy that wasn't just, we will take gifts of land but not gifts of art, but rather, what does it mean to work with corporations, right? Who will we accept that gift from? Who won't we accept that gift from? And not just the who, but the when. To what Lee was saying of like, what are those restrictions that you put on the gift that we're going to say, you know what, that doesn't align with our values, because we know that we need to work in partnership with people who do have this wealth, and at the same time, we need to meet the needs of our community. We all exist within the system, within nonprofit organizations, within a capitalist system that runs within the systems that make America work, that have prioritized and privileged people who are white and already have a great deal of privilege. So we can't change the system overnight, though there's lots of great work being done to deconstruct that system, but we need to think about what are those boundaries that we need to put on it, and what are the policies that we can create within our own shops, that when these moments come up, that we have some guidance, because you feel it in your gut when you're like, ooh, this is one of those things that doesn't feel good, and you have in that moment a decision to make. And it's easier to make that decision if you've already had the conversations about what are your values and where are your boundaries.
Thank you. Really outstanding. Rihanna, I'm going to come back to you with a question about recommendations that you might make. What I'm thinking is, what are the changes we can make in our organizations to reduce the chances of having these moments in the future? And I'll offer you a metaphor that maybe for everybody to think about in their minds here. If the fire department waits until a fire happens until they discuss what is a fire and when do we respond, versus speaking in advance about what is a fire and how we would prepare to respond. Those are two very, very, very different frameworks about how to fight fire. And we're talking as fundraising leaders about fighting against some really kind of evil and terrible forces that would take control of our organization. So we need to be anticipating and thinking in advance about how to prevent this kind of work. So what guidance might you offer us to think about some changes, practical, not stuff that's impossible, stuff that's possible for us to do to make changes in our organizations to reduce the chance of having moments like this in the future?
Yeah, I think the very first thing that I like to do is, even before I take a job, is ask really good questions. You're interviewing the organization just as much as they're interviewing you. So I ask questions about, to make sure there's a values and ethical match, about their approaches. How do they handle situations where a donor wants something that we're not prepared to give? How do they talk about injustice and inequities and racism and white supremacy? Do you talk to your donors about where their wealth comes from? Things like that. And those questions, I think if you find yourself working for an organization that answers those questions well, that aligns with your values, I think some of these ethical issues can almost be headed off. But for our own organizations that we're in now, I think there's a lot of things you can do. I have proactive conversations with all levels of the agency. My ED and I are constantly forwarding each other articles and talking about our values and how we fundraise. We're grounding our decisions in our values. We talk about why we fundraise in certain ways. Like Maya said, having a really strong gift acceptance policy is key. But like she mentioned, you have to have your values in it. And then I think it's also really just a lot of grounding yourself in the same language and values and expectations, so that you can, before it happens, how you'll react. And we also have preemptive conversations on my team about, theoreticals, hypotheticals. How would we do this? And then we also talk to our donors. We talk about our mission, our values, and how that shows up in our work. We talk about, why we do certain things. And when your donors are grounded in your values, it makes it a lot easier to tell them no and explain to them why. I've had times where I've had to tell a donor, thank you so much. Can't really, that's not quite, doesn't quite align, but these are the reasons why. But let's talk about how else we can work together. And then I also really think that we all should be embedding our values in our fundraising plan and really looking at how are we supporting the community, who's missing, whose voices are missing, who are we not asking, who are we talking to, how are we telling our stories? And I have also gone to my ED and said, these are the things that I want to do. Let's be on board. Let's get on board. Let's get on the same page. So that way, when you are in that position, you're ready.
Excellent. Thank you. Lee,
oh, sorry. Can I have one more thing?
Please, of course.
The other thing that I have done that I think has really helped is also I've shown my board and my ED examples of what happens when you lead with your values. So there are some really good examples of organizations that have said no to gifts and done better. So I'm thinking about Girl Scouts of Western Washington. I think it was like 5 or 6 years ago. They got $100,000 gift, which was a huge chunk of their, I think it was their summer scholarship fund or something. But the donor wanted them to exclude transgender girls. And so they said, you know what, that's Girl Scouts is for everyone. That's not our values. And they said, thanks, but no thanks. And they ended up launching a fundraising campaign to replace those funds. And they ended up raising like over 3 times what they had lost. So I think when you show examples like that to your leadership, it empowers them to make decisions, because so often we're motivated by fear that if I say no to this donor, that's $500,000. That means people are losing their jobs, programs don't happen, the community, the people we serve are not getting served. And so I think that can really help align your values with practice.
Thank you, Hannah. Couldn't agree more. Lee, there was a lot of uptick in response in the chat to when you commented on being willing to not get the gift. And so I'm going to, on the spot, change your question a little bit to ask you a follow-up on that, because clearly a lot of people were both kind of applauding that and interested in more. I'm going to also, before I ask you that question, let people know that indeed, if they want to pop a question in the chat, we welcome that for the panelists. I will say that our greatest goal with this conversation today is not for it to be one and done, but for this to be an ongoing conversation of trusted professional colleagues who want to create the spaces where we can keep talking about this and we can do the right thing. So if you put a question in the chat, we would be here for about the next 48 hours probably to answer all the questions. So we might not do that, but we're going to record these. We're going to track on these, and we'll pull them together and make sure that we consolidate a list of these questions. And we're going to encourage all of you at home and in your offices and around Advancement Northwest, and in the hallways of wherever you're working and talking with peers to keep these questions alive. But let me go to Lee on the next one, and if you've got a great question you want to toss in the chat, please do that. So Lee, it sounds great to say you got to be willing to not get the gift. I've been in the position, together with my colleagues, certainly in some prior organizations, where we've had to give money back because there was behavior by a donor. To go away from vaccines, I'll talk about sexual harassment, right? And there have been situations where we've given money back and said, look, we simply can't accept this money, and we also need to essentially fire you as a donor. And we're not going to just do it obliquely. We're going to be clear about the reasons and all. That's can be an unpopular thing for a fundraiser to say to a board of directors or to an executive director. So what advice have you got for the person who's on this call right now who's like, well, that's nice if Lee Lambert says that, he's the executive director. But, in my role as a development manager, development director, what can I say? How can I make the case? How can I, what advice have you got for that person who's on this call right now thinking, boy, I wish I had the guts to do what Lee just said?
Well, I think Rehana just gave a great example. And I think the way in which I approach our work, and we're blessed to live in Seattle, which is a very wealthy city. I think I just read in the paper there are 100 billionaires in Washington State, which is a lot. Is you can't approach this work with a scarcity mindset. Because when you assume that there are limited resources and finite gifts to be had out there, one, it discourages collaboration with other organizations, and two, it makes you get a little farther into the gray area because you are feeling forced to meet your quota or your goal. And so when I entered this field and what I try to cultivate on my team is that there is an abundance of resources out there. There is a literal abundance of resources out there. And if we say no to this gift, there'll be two more that follow it. And a part of it is the approach in which we look at this is that, a good colleague of mine said, we're not asking people for funds. We are philanthropic advisors and experts in the field. So just like when I hire a plumber and I ask them to do something, I have plumbers that work outside and we have plumbers that work inside. And when I ask the outside plumber to work inside, he says, I'm not your guy. You need to call somebody else. And if I ask them to do some electrical work, that's not their work. And so I look at our work as like, we are philanthropic advisors that help corporations have this type of impact they want to have, or individuals have the type of impact they want to have, or foundations achieve their mission. And if we approach our work in that way, and there's an abundance of folks out there, it makes it easy to say no, because we're not their people. That's okay. They can give money to somebody else that will get them the thing they need, but that's not us.
Thank you, Lee. On the call is Sri Lakshmi Ramala, and I see she's pointing out something that came up, uniquely in this case that I think is worthy of our reflecting on, which is in many cases the nonprofits and in many nonprofits, that the beneficiaries and the donors are in completely different kind of communities or contexts for a particular reason. In this case with COVID, that's both global and local, and everyone's impacted by it. And vaccination is global and local, and everybody's impacted by it. In this case, beneficiaries or people who could have been beneficiaries of vaccines, we're in the same group as the donors. And so this kind of bubbles up a whole new set of questions when we use a term in philanthropy like self-dealing, or the concern that a philanthropist's gift, is for their own benefit. So Maya, I'm going to turn to you now because you knew you were next, and ask you to help us, with this question. I mean, this was a unique situation around the vaccine specifically, where donors were in the position of benefiting from their own gift. Can you give us an idea about the kind of education of donors and frankly the education of staff in as Lee says, being philanthropic advisors? How do we educate people about what's really true, what's really fair, what's really just in our fundraising world?
I think that it is important to be having these conversations ahead of time, and when you are asking for donations, for let's say a hospital where you do have that commingling of donors, maybe also people who are receiving services. But when you're asking for funds, usually what you're asking for is to build a new ward or to cover the care for uncompensated care for people who are existing without a necessary level of insurance that they should have access to and to reach that care that they need, right? So that's really clear that yes, you're asking this person for a gift, but it's not for those services they're receiving. And so I think it's back to, when we look at our communications or we look at our donor plans, we're very clear about there are different audiences who have different, we're able to segment who's where, what do they care about, what feels differently. And so I actually think it's really disingenuous to say that a sophisticated hospital couldn't actually do the same thing, just look at their folks and say, the people who really need access to these vaccines are those essential workers who are putting their lives on the line every day to make sure that we have food and transportation and that our systems are still working and in place. And say, well, we can't reach them, right? Like we can't prioritize them. So we're just going to go with the folks whose emails we already have who all happen to give $10,000 or more, right? Like I think that it's back to especially as nonprofits, legally, we are created as nonprofits to serve a certain need in our community. And that's what our missions are about. That's why we get the tax breaks that we do. That's why we can receive donations. So I think it's also about how do you keep that in front and center, and have those conversations. I also fully want to understand that I saw some questions in the chat about, if you're just the giving officer and you get this mandate, what do you do about that? And I fully understand, especially if you're somebody with a target identity, you may not feel safe in that moment standing up. And so I think that that's where, if you are in a place of positional power, if you are the director, if you are the manager, if you are the executive director, how do you build in some of that psychological safety that Lee was talking about to have those people call you on, something you missed, right? And on a scotoma you had where there was this issue and you didn't even think about it. You have to build a lot of trust with your team before somebody's going to bring this to your attention. And wouldn't you rather have one of your fundraisers bring this to your attention and be like, I think this is a bad idea, let's undo it, before it hits the front page of the Seattle Times?
Excellent. I really appreciate that. We're about to transition in a few minutes toward the breakout groups, and I'm going to give each of our panelists one more. In this case, I'm going to ask them a question to make a recommendation. I'm going to ask them all kind of the same question and recommendations. And we're going to move to the space, Maya, that you were just talking about, which is kind of qualitatively, what's needed? What are the conditions we can put in place? And I'm thinking more in terms of like emotional safety, for example, versus kind of one more policy or one more, whatever. That like what, who are we creating organizations that have ethical behaviors that center equity and ethics and compassion, in our work. So if you can be reflecting, I'm going to talk for just a second to give you a chance to put your thoughts together. But I'm thinking about the qualitative ways or the behaviors, the things we can do in our organizations to create a culture that, that supports the right thing happening. And before I ask you that question, I just want to share that for some years, when I hear from donors who, you've all heard this on this call, someone will say to you, oh, those darn nonprofits, they're all competing with each other. It's kind of like, they're like, I wish they weren't all in competition. They should all merge. I just want to fund, you'll just hear these kinds of conversations. I love to say back to donors, who are, we're not in competition with each other. We're in competition against unethical fundraisers. And frankly, the reason I'm a member of AFP is because I'm in competition against unethical fundraising. I look across town to Solid Ground as someone at Wellspring, and I say, I'm not in competition with them. We work together on trying to fight poverty, right? And to work on equity. And in our cases, we're both serving, families facing homelessness, for example. I don't want Solid Ground to lose and Wellspring to win. I want us both to be successful. Like, competition is not my thing as a nonprofit leader, except when it comes to people doing unethical activities or people increasing inequity, people promoting racism, sexism, harassment, whatever that is. So I want to encourage you all also to think about the conversations around ethics aren't only for the day that it shows up on the front page of the Seattle Times and someone says, oh, there was a scandal. Well, how about proactively for the next years to come, we proactively raise the topic with our donors that the reason we exist as a nonprofit is we play a role in healing our community, our society, right? And that we're quite competitive against unethical fundraisers and a few other things. So I'll just offer that to you all. And as we transition, I want to ask the three of you to just ask for kind of a practical recommendation about, as you know, as we go back to our shops, as we work with our own teams, what are the behaviors, what are the conditions we can be creating to support healthy development cultures where we behave ethically? And then after you three answer, we're going to then transition pretty quickly here into breakout groups. So you all who have a mass of wisdom and insight, have been so far been listening on the call, we want you to be able to share with each other. But let's just go popcorn style. Who feels inspired to, between the three of you, who feels inspired to go first on what are the behaviors and the things we can be doing differently?
I think so much of this does come back to where does our leadership, where are we having these conversations, right? Like so much of this starts with that examination. What is our purpose? What is our mission? What are the values that we are espousing? And then how does that show up in our work, right? It's one thing to have the value statement that stands on the wall, but like, how does that translate into my work, into your work? If we're really saying that we're trying to undo oppression, what does that look like in our work? And how do we have that conversation with the board? There was a great comment in there that was like, yeah, how do you get the board on board, right? You need to have these explicit conversations with them, and not one time. This is an ongoing conversation that we need to make time and space for. On a monthly basis, on a weekly basis, on your check-ins with your supervisor or with the folks you supervise, right? How are you talking about this and centering your work in those values and in the community on a regular basis, so that it's understood that this is just part of who you are.
Yeah, I think I might add on to that. I think kind of just a practical practice is going back over past decisions and having dialogues about those. Some of these ethical calls are easy. It is right in front of your face, and it's not a difficult. And some of them, they're gray and they're on the line, and you don't realize you probably would have made a different choice until after the fact. And it's important for the people who are in the development office to talk about it and say, hey, like a thing happened and we're here. Let's not have that happen again, and here's why, and use that and learn from the past mistakes or close calls, because none of us are perfect in this space, and we're going to make mistakes, and we hope we don't make really, really bad ones.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Maya and Lee have just said. I mean, I think it is just so critical that we're looking at how we're putting our values into practice. And at launch, we do that in everything we do. I mean, we start every single meeting with looking at grounding ourselves in our values. And we use Equity Matters has something called the color brave space. So we're always thinking about how we show up in this work. And then I think a real practical thing other than what they mentioned was also really sitting down with your development team and thinking about what you value in terms of not just your organizational values, but your fundraising practices and how you want to show up, how you want to do this work, what feels good. Like Maya said earlier, you know when it feels bad. Like you know when you're like, that just didn't feel so good right now. So I think then you can create your plan, your activities, your tactical calendar, really grounded in how your aspirations for how you want to show up in this work.
Wonderful. Thank you, three. I'm going to ask everybody, there's like, 300 of us or something. I'm going to ask you to put your hands up in the air and start doing this to say thank you to our three panelists, because Rehana and Maya and Lee have just been fabulous. And we want to say thank you to them. We want to thank you for their wisdom. I believe that, it's kind of like the golden ticket in Willy Wonka or something. You might wind up in a breakout group where one of these three people is in your breakout group. So, you may get to continue that conversation. But I'm going to hand the logistics of this back to Daniel Webb. We're going to begin moving to breakout groups so you can all share together, and then we'll kind of come back in the end. But I'm just thrilled for the wisdom this group is sharing. Thank you, each one of you.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks to the panelists. That was an outstanding conversation, and love all the comments in the chat. Want to lift out one that came towards the end about suggestions of why don't we have training for our donors. I really like that and think that could be a great conversation for us to engage in at a future time. We're going to get into breakout spaces now of about 6 to 8 folks. Just want to acknowledge, I think we all probably have a lot to say on this topic. So just as we go into this space, I hope you can all be mindful of your talk time. Let's try to give everyone a chance to chime in on this topic, and let's really actively listen. There's a lot of different parts to this conversation, and there are going to be different opinions and different perspectives. We need to acknowledge there will be multiple truths and multiple ideas on the table. This is an uncomfortable conversation in many ways, and I think you should expect going into these breakout spaces that it might be slightly uncomfortable. And we can also expect that we're not going to solve everything today, and we can expect to have non-closure in this space. We as Advancement Northwest will be hosting another virtual event on February 18th that will give us a chance to continue this conversation in part. So look forward to more details on that, knowing that we're not going to be able to conclude this conversation today. So with that, I'll ask Brittany to pop us into breakout spaces, and hope you enjoy the dialogue.